Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter, of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today, we will hear the presentation, Equity and Public Transportation, Current Trends and Recommendations. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your webcast toolbar. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the questions box located in your webinar toolbar, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If your question is for a particular panelist, I'll just ask that you state that within your question so I know who to direct it to. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all of those participating for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, in particular, we are being sponsored by the Planning and the Black Community Division of APA, so thanks to them, and we'll hear a bit more about them in just a moment. Coming up on your screen is that's my sidekick in the background there, my coworker. We have upcoming webcasts. We're actually booked into December now. So with that, we are starting to open up Wednesdays and Thursdays. So you will notice in the near future, as you're able to start registering for more and more of our webcasts, that in parentheses, it'll say if it's not Friday, so Wednesday or Thursday. Just because we're trying to keep up with everyone doing digital conferences and sessions online. We're just trying to help out. So there will be a multitude of sessions coming up for you to register for. So visit ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and that's where you can register for all of our upcoming webcasts, and you can see them. So as we get information, we'll be updating this page. And this is a screenshot of this page. So if you look up at the top, you're going to see some tabs. If you click prior webcasts, you'll be able to download PDFs of all of our prior webcasts. Distance education tab, we have several sessions available for on-demand viewing, which means at any point from now until the end of December, you can view these particular webcasts and you can log credit at your leisure. We have one ethics, one law, and I think one regular, all worth 1.5 CM credits. So be sure to visit our webcast webpage for all this great information. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. To log those credits, head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. From there, you can either search by today's title or the event number. The event number is listed there. If you don't get a second to write these down, you can just head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and you'll be able to get all that information there. We are also recording our webcasts. We record all of our webcasts and we post them up onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to us. Head over to youtube.com and type in Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our over 300 videos and over 3,000 subscribers. So be sure to check that out. And like us on Facebook, just head over to Facebook and click on Planning Webcast. And there you'll be able to see any updates or information on switches or changes of our webcasts, or when we have new webcasts that are available for you to go register. So be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to us on YouTube. With that, I am going to now get us started here and turn it over to Carlton, who will give a quick introduction and get things moving. Let me get my sharing screen up. Okay, Carlton, it's all you.
Okay, great.
Testing 1, 2.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Christine, for hosting us for today's webinar. My name is Carlton Ely, and I am the president of the Ely Group. We are a consulting firm that works at the intersection of equity and planning, and we are in the business of giving sustainability a push. Today's discussion is important and timely. Before I get ahead of myself, I need to acknowledge the Planning and the Black Community Division of the American Planning Association is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Since 1980, the division has been committed to the professional development of its members, creating great communities for all, as well as elevating important policy issues. I also need to acknowledge that members of the Planning and the Black Community Division are feeling a profound sense of sadness because the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery were cut short due to acts of violence. The executive board for the division released a statement in early June. This is an issue that hits close to home because one of our presenters was actually harassed by 3 security guards while taking photos of a planning project that he personally worked on in his own community. The Planning and the Black Community Division has a long history of speaking up, and we hope you are compelled to speak up when injustice occurs. Because of recent events, there are 2 points that I want to stress. First, it is time for practitioners to take equity in planning seriously. And second, equity is a competency we want to see in professional planners. The Planning and the Black Community Division invited me to offer an overview on equity in the context of planning. We have 3 presenters who are transportation planners who will speak directly to the issue of equity and public transportation. While preparing for today's webinar, I was reminded that civil unrest has had an odd impact on my career. When I became a planning student, the nation was still under a shadow that was cast by the LA civil unrest in 1992. Unfortunately, the prevailing response to the LA riots was to shift attention from the topic of race. What followed was a policy of avoidance, colorblindness, and bureaucratic neutrality. The legacy of this response is still evident today. Many academic planning programs lack robust curriculum on the topic of equity. Within work environments, it's not uncommon for staff to suggest equity is beyond their purview. And in recent years, it was evident by the absence of appropriate content at national conferences. Today's webinar is a reminder that a policy of avoidance does not correct disparities in the built environment. 2 years ago, I was asked to chair the American Planning Association's Social Equity Task Force. Experience has taught me that when you facilitate large groups, define your terms early. The functional definition I use as a practitioner is equity is a condition of parity that is achieved by being intentional about improving quality of life for populations that are underserved, under-resourced, and vulnerable. And because this is a functional definition, it is informed by 3 questions planners and civil servants need to ask to avoid the problem of a moving target. Are there deficits in our society? Who is experiencing the burden of the deficits? And how do we make sure well-intentioned interventions don't make deficits worse? The reason I am carefully explaining this is because benefits don't merely trickle down from populations that are more well off to other populations in need. Instead, equity requires making investments where those investments are needed the most. Normally, when I offer remarks on this topic, I tend to emphasize history as prologue. Now, I'm not going to overwhelm you with a lot of history today. However, the soundbite message is when you understand history in the context of city and regional planning, you can encourage better public policy and avoid repeating the same mistakes. One point that I do need to acknowledge is the International City-County Management Association tends to stress that planning at its best takes into account the social implications of land use and economic development decisions. What this means is planning is not professionally or institutionally separate from the social realm. In practical terms, it means we are a nation of 324 million people. We have citizens from all walks of life, and if we don't think critically about how to meet the needs of vulnerable populations properly, then we may fall short in ensuring that everyone has a safe and healthy environment in which to live, work, and play. It's worth noting that ICMA's position is not an isolated incident. The social implications of land use and economic development decisions have been a recurring theme in planning practice for the past 55 years. This slide offers a quick listing of initiatives that have focused on fostering a sense of balance in planning and development practice. We can look to people like Paul Davidoff, Norman Krumholtz, and many other champions. As trailblazers, they didn't take the position that a season of focusing on equity will pass. Instead, they anticipated that focusing on equity could become the new normal for planners. And because of their efforts, we have years of institutional knowledge to build on. Currently, the approach that's gained traction is equitable development, and PolicyLink has been the main proponent of the approach. I need to mention the 2018 Equity Summit convened by PolicyLink exceeded 4,000 attendees. This is a clear indication the organization has done a marvelous job sustaining public attention on the issue for 20 years. Traditionally, the hurdles to addressing social equity as we work to revitalize communities have been first, framing how to implement it during the planning process, visualizing the product from that process, and correcting the misperception that addressing this issue may slow down development. However, thanks to the tireless efforts of researchers and advocates, the creative thinking of planners and architects, and the compelling results of determined community builders, those barriers are coming down. This is not the work of tomorrow. It really is the work of right now. And just in case you missed it, 2015 was a very impressive year. Many groups had something to say about social equity in the context of planning. This is a sampling of the organizations that conducted discussions on the topic, too many to fit on one slide, and a clear sign of pent-up demand. Perhaps there is consensus that doing what we've always done is no longer good enough, and it's now time to find our true north. Normally, I like to introduce case examples. However, I thought it would be more appropriate to offer some advice prior to concluding. Advancing equity is not a new trend in the planning profession. This is an old conversation, and we have had some false starts in the past. Working in the public sector taught me change is a choice before it is an act. How do planners earn their AICP certification? They make a choice to go all in, and they follow it up with an investment of time and effort. Without belaboring the point, I made a conscious decision to work on equity because I didn't want to enable the status quo. Although planners love to discuss tools and solutions, the act of making a serious commitment is an important starting point that shouldn't be overlooked. Second, it is heartbreaking when a public program takes the position that equity is a distraction, beyond their purview, or not critical to their mission. When an institution is myopic, it is incumbent for individuals to become mythbusters. In 2007, the Planning and the Black Community Division set out to be a mythbuster by organizing a 3-day technical assistance workshop in Gary, Indiana, that focused on how to strike a balance between encouraging development while protecting the sense of place. By the end of the exercise, the division effectively demonstrated that you can conduct a successful visioning workshop that addresses equitable development if you have the will and the desire to do it. The June issue of Planning magazine focuses on the impacts of COVID-19, and one of the cover articles is "We Didn't Plan for This." My personal commentary is this: when responsible parties subscribe to a policy of neglect, which has been the case in the United States, you are going to be overwhelmed by your blind spots. Finally, equity is not optional, it's not a trade-off, and it isn't an add-on. Advancing equity is about the promise that we make to ourselves as practitioners. A few years ago, Robin Collins of Willamette University in Oregon offered a moral argument for sustainability. She said we shouldn't dig a hole and then put the future of our children in it. I respect the point made by Professor Collins, but I believe there's a nuance to her point that we shouldn't overlook. Simply, we shouldn't dig a hole and then put the future of someone else in it. When planning and development decisions are made based on what's comfortable or fashionable, with little regard for the ripple effect, we're putting someone else's future in a hole. In the end, We need planners who understand equity is not advanced through serendipity. Instead, it is the outcome of clearly set expectations, collaborative problem solving, and persistent leadership. In closing, I need to mention I completed my graduate studies in 1998. When I left, I had a degree in one hand and unanswered questions about social equity in the other. And the question was, what does social equity look like when it's addressed through planning? Since 1998, I've walked a path that Alan Altshuler of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design described in the following manner. He said, no planner would be able to consider his education complete who has not grappled with the dilemmas that Norman Krumholtz faced. And he made that statement in a book entitled Making Equity Planning Work. I'm on this journey because I'm compensating for the things that I didn't learn in an academic setting. So my final words of encouragement are be bold, be curious, and be mindful, because the public is relying on us as planners, as urban designers, and as architects to move beyond our comfort zones. If you would like to learn more, here are some resources for your consideration. First, the American Planning Association has published an official position on equity as a topic. The Planning for Equity Policy Guide was adopted and released last year. APA also published a Planning Advisory Service memo on equitable development in 2017. The memo helped to re-energize a conversation among APA members that equity needs to be a priority. The Environmental Protection Agency has a landing page on their website that focuses on the intersection of environmental justice and equitable development. Also, EPA's Office of Environmental Justice has published several place-based tools, including a guide on collaborative problem solving. The Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina is prominently featured in this guide. And I mentioned that because the Regenesis Project received a National Planning Excellence Award in 2015. Last, there is a YouTube channel devoted to this topic as well. Finally, I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion, and it's now my pleasure to welcome our next presenter, Fred Neal Jr. Fred is the senior planner with Villavasso and Associates. And currently, the controls have been switched over to Fred, and so he's now loading his slideshow now.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted, and let me get this started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. And Carlton, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to jump right in. What you see on this slide, well, I titled my presentation, Equity, Opportunity, and Transit. What you see on this slide in the background is a picture of the front gate of Armstrong Park. Armstrong Park is actually the home of Congo Square. Congo Square was a location that when New Orleans' early days was considered the back of town. And it was a location where on Sundays, for part of the day, some slaves were allowed to congregate to eat, to drink, to dance, and to fellowship. So it's a historic space for many, historic and spiritual space for many folks in New Orleans. Although Armstrong Park also has another context. It was a project that came out of the urban renewal of the 60s and 70s, and in part connected to a freeway project that cut through an historically Black neighborhood. This picture is from about 4 years ago, where Ride New Orleans, a transit advocacy group that I was one of the founders of, held a rally there to talk about, ask the transit agency to put more shelters for bus riders. And the thought is that transit riders deserve respect. So I wanted to start with this to comment on how we think about the protests in our public spaces. A lot of public spaces have complicated histories, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. I thank PBCD for their statement, and I want to say I think we have to acknowledge in thinking about equity, number one, that Black Lives Matter. The second thing I want to start with is that we also have to center any conversation about transit, which should be centered with the thoughts about transit equity. So a little bit about myself, as Carter mentioned, I'm a planner, AICP member, APA member. In my professional work, we generally do a lot of land use, planning, code development. I'm not technically a transit planner, although I'm a transit rider, micromobility user, a transit advocate, and for the past 2 years or so, have been a commissioner of our regional transit authority. But I said that to say that transit is personal to me. And in this picture, I'm not the one at the microphone. At the microphone is Flozo Daniels, who was a transit commissioner at the time. Now he is chair of our transit authority board. Beside him is Jared Brissett, wearing the blue blazer, who is a council member in Transit Ally, New Orleans City Council. Alex Pozorski is head of the of Ride New Orleans, which is mentioned the Riders Advocacy Organization. I'm in the corner holding a sign, and I put this up there partially to give a brief introduction, but to say that, again, there is space for everyone to talk about transit and talk about equity, and sometimes our role is just as powerful, being the person there to hold the sign and stand there and support our elected leaders when they make the right decision, and when they don't make the right decisions, call them out on that. And so I want to say again, also thanks to our chair Flozo Daniels, the picture. It's become a great ally and proponent of really thinking about equity. Also want to just very quickly thank our regional transit authority team and our CEO Alex Wiggins, who is very supportive of our conversations and really trying to implement equity, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more briefly. Last, I'll say I'm also a trustee of Transit Center, which is a foundation that's really focused on using public transit as a way to make cities more just and sustainable. As a founding principle, I believe transit equity public transit is important for increasing mobility opportunities, especially for people of low incomes and people of color. But additionally, transit has a well-benefited, documented environmental and economic benefits, but it also can and should be a powerful tool to advance racial equity and social justice in American cities. I mentioned Transit Center. This picture is a page from a report by Transit Center called Winning Transit that's really focused on advocacy and developing advocacy. But one of the key points of the report in this page talks about how equity should be instrumental to our communities and equity should be instrumental to good transit. Carlton actually used the word intentional, and I will say that equity should also be intentional. This page highlights a wonderful advocacy group, Active Transportation Alliance in Chicago, and a picture of Chicago's mayor, Honorable Lori Lightfoot. And it really talks about how Active Trans really engaged in the election in 2019 around social equity, and how Mayor Lightfoot is really someone that embraced that during the campaign and has taken some of the recommendations to advance them as mayor. This slide is also to say, I apologize that we have to acknowledge some of the wonderful leadership of our Black female mayors in this country. On this slide is a picture of our mayor, Mayor LaToya Cantrell. However, this was when she was a councilwoman at one of our advocacy events of a ride, and really supporting transit. And I think it's really powerful, some of the voices and how these voices are really reshaping cities. Also, and there's some other council members in this picture. One other person in the red shirt is Mrs. Valerie Jefferson, who is one of our bus operators. And at the time, I think last year, or the end of 2019, or I think she was, she's right now current president of the New Orleans chapter of the ATU, the Amalgamated Transit Union. And Ms. Valerie is a powerhouse and a force of nature, but I acknowledge that there is a role in talking about transit equity. It's not just the agency staff, but it's also our operators and folks who are doing the work. And we want to acknowledge how much we value those people. Also want to say transit equity doesn't just rest in our transit agencies, but it rests in our city and our city leadership and our MPOs. And again, I thank Mayor Cantrell for my appointment and for her work in really rethinking about how cities should work. So I'm going to talk more specifically about a planning process that we're doing at RTA, but I want to, I'm actually going to go back a slide. I do want to very briefly say that we should talk about transit equity in a lot of spaces. We don't necessarily talk about transit equity, especially in our public infrastructure, streets and sidewalks. Every transit trip starts with someone using a sidewalk or a walking path or some type of other right of way, right? Very few people catch transit from their front door to the front door of their office. So we can't talk about transit equity without talking about universal accessibility and how we really rethink our public spaces. Including that should be bus priority lanes and other treatments that prioritize transit, especially when transit provides a great community, wonderful community benefit. Mark will read those side, but when thinking about micromobility, how it integrates with transit, and also when thinking about new technologies, you think about electric vehicle, autonomous vehicles, but we don't always ask the question about, oh, does this really further equitable transit in our communities? And I think we're doing ourselves an injustice if we're not answering those questions. So I want to transition quickly to a New Orleans focused conversation and cite Katrina. This could be an hours long conversation, but in short, with all the devastating loss in Katrina, city of New Orleans lost almost our entire bus fleet. Even to this day, we only have about a third of the transit buses that we had before Katrina. There was a lot of emphasis obviously on rebuilding and planning, but transit, I don't want to say transit wasn't emphasized, but maybe we weren't having the right conversations about transit and also about how transit can be used how transit works with changing land use and demographics. And when we think about equity as a priority, this slide just simply says what happened by 2016. We have recovered only 42% of the pre-storm bus trips, but more than 100% of the pre-storm weekly streetcar trips. How does that happen? It happens because we invested in additional streetcars. This is not meant to negative the streetcars. I think we get caught up on mode too often, but we spent a lot of public money and we didn't necessarily increase accessibility. This is a frequency comparison. Green is good, red is bad. Green is 15 minutes or less. Red is almost an hour headways. This has gotten slightly better in the past few years, but it is still a problem and something we need to address. In short, transit, really reflects access to opportunity. This slide shows jobs accessible in 30 minutes or less versus transit versus driving. The blue is driving. In 2016, 89% of the region's jobs were accessible by transit were accessible if you had a car driving within 30 minutes or less. If you were taking transit or walking, that number was 12%. That is an unequitable transit system. And I always like to leave that up for a little bit people to see that it's a reflection graphically of what unequitable transit looks like. The number is slightly better now, but it is still a huge disparity there. So how do we change that? One of the things that we did do very well in the past few years is you have to plan. I think thinking about planners, you have to have a plan to guide you. We have, a few years ago, the agency developed a strategic mobility plan, and due to a lot of the hard work of advocates, and we were able to make equity a core proponent of the plan. One of the 5 goals is to be equitable. And again, going back to what Carlton said, equity is intentional. And I think we take for granted we do planning, but it is important to call it out. So what is the next step? This plan was adopted about 3 years ago. We realized that one of the main problems was we have an unequitable network. It's not a regional network. We decided to embark on a process called comprehensive operations analysis and a network redesign. They're 2 kind of parallel processes. That is essentially thinking about if we could start over and draw a clean slate, what should our network look like and how should it look like? We're basing it on working with existing resources, but it's really an opportunity to about it. I want to say is that many cities have done this over the past few years. It's a very popular tool and very needed. However, I will say that if not done with equity as a focus, you can end up with, after a network redesign, with a network that's even less equitable. So it is important, again, that equity and planners think about equity to drive it. How do you get there? One of the things we have to do is really, well, use data. This is reflecting how data is used, you can see, but you have to focus on outreach and really using all the tools in the planner's toolbox, but outreach. And outreach that isn't just meetings in the evening, not just writer surveys during daytime hours. New Orleans has the New Orleans economy is driven often by the hospitality service industry, and those aren't 9-to-5 jobs. One of the things I think we did really well with New Links, and it's still, and I'll talk about where we're at and where we're going, is making sure to reach out to riders and doing it where riders are. So a few months ago, I joined some of the planners on a ride on our late night New Orleans East Owl at 2 a.m. I learned more about transit in those 2.5 hours riding that bus and talking to riders who were, most of them were getting ready to go to work or leaving work from their jobs where they walk from French Quarter restaurants or elsewhere. And you can't really get an equitable network if you're not talking to the riders and not really valuing those folks who are using your system at all times. This is really just another slide, shows how we're thinking regionally in the 3 different concepts. But last, as I move toward the end, I want to say this slide is really important in some of the outreach materials. I want to thank Ride New Orleans and our friends at the New Orleans Regional Planning Commission and the planners at the Regional Transit Authority who spent a lot of time really think about how do we talk about equity and bring equity into this planning process, and how do we show equity? I think 3 pieces. Number 1, using very clear language. Planners can get caught up in the technical, especially transportation planners. An overview of explaining really briefly and succinctly what this means for people who use transit daily. Example commutes, and you might not be able to read the words, but there are 2 specific areas, New Orleans East and areas in the West Bank of New Orleans that have high populations of people of color and they don't have good enough transit right now. Those areas were specifically identified as places that we need to be able to go into reach and really message and connect with. So creating sample example commutes for riders who live in those areas about how would the commute look, what does it look now, how is it different, and really specifically calling out those areas. Last, using data and metrics that really recognize and connect to equity. Obviously, total jobs is important, but low-income jobs are accessible by transit. Zero-car households is access to transit, which is huge in New Orleans. We have one of the highest populations of households without access to a vehicle. And really important, access to high-frequency transit. For many folks, just having a bus that comes once an hour isn't really transit. But if you can give them access to a bus or streetcar that comes every 15 minutes, that can change their life. As I move toward the end, and one last thing, we are in the stage of getting a final recommendation. The planners were going to tie it to equity as part of our network recommendation. When that comes later this summer, it's going to be a companion with the detailed equity and access report to really define and to really explain how we're forward this. I want to end with one more transit center report called Inclusive Transit. And this is available on the website, but it has 6 recommendations for really institutionalizing and affirming transit equity. I'm not going to read them all, but number 2, there are 2 I want to highlight. Number 2, transit access, such as fare policies. There's been a lot of conversations around free fares. I think this should be a very local conversation, agency specific. But what I do want to say is, in many places, the main complaint about transit isn't that it's too expensive, it's that it doesn't get folks where they have to go, it's not available, it's not safe. And I think we have to be careful about jumping to this idea of free fares if we don't address all the other issues first. And again, with COVID and some of the financial holes, it becomes more important to provide agencies with the resources they need. All of these are important, but the last one I want to say, transit agencies should decriminalize fare evasion. And this ties in with obviously some of the defund the police conversations. But transit agencies play a part in that. And this does not mean that there shouldn't be fair enforcement. I just talked about how, we need to really think locally about how we, if, fares and having equitable fare structures, but we shouldn't be arresting people or taking punitive action for someone not having a $2.50 transit fare. And I think it's something agencies are thinking about and talking with and are going to have to figure out. So thank y'all for listening to me. I appreciate it. And here's my contact information. And I'm going to turn it over to Fleming. So I'm sorry, to Kenya, Mr. Kenya Will.
Great. Well, Brett, thank you for that great presentation of setting the stage for what's happening in New Orleans, as well as really talking about the need for the policies that you were just talking about with Transit Center being put in place for transit operators across the country, and ensuring that equity is front and center in how we ensure that our policies are affecting and benefiting those who are most in need of support. Again, my name is Kenya Wheeler. I'm a principal transportation planner with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, and I am going to be going over kind of, as Carlton was saying, basically, making the policy that we want for transit equity intentional. We're going to talk about an example of that here in California, in our agency's service equity strategy. Muni is the transit brand name for San Francisco MTA, and many of you in the profession know about Muni. We're one of the largest transit operator in terms of daily riders in Northern California, and I'm going to go over how this policy was enacted, some of its benefits that it's brought, and some challenges that we've observed, as well as to talk about other efforts happening in the Bay Area region. As you can see from the photo, San Francisco is a rapidly growing city, as the nation's and really one of the global hubs for new technology. It's a area that's also very high cost, and yet we have people don't always recognize that we have a large number of San Franciscans who work in the industries that support our global economy, but that aren't making the high salaries that you hear about in the tech world. And so we play a critical role in providing mobility for not just the software developers, but the folks who are providing service jobs and kids and families and seniors. And so there's been a lot of advocacy in the Bay Area around providing transportation access for all. And actually there was even efforts by advocacy groups, and this kind of gets on what Fred was saying, that there really is sort of an inside-outside game that happens, I think, in a lot of these measures, just as the political leaders and the Fred's advocacy group was really pushing for RTA in New Orleans to have equitable service. Here in the Bay Area, we've had community organizations, push policymakers to advocate for equitable transit. Our agency was actually, at one point, there was a talk of a charter amendment requiring a social equity funding program. That did not happen, but what did happen was that our board of directors took an affirmative action to adopt a service equity policy in 2014. And so that codifies and really makes it very intentional that, as it says on the slide here, that we want to make sure that routes that are most critical for communities of color and for low-income populations are improved. And the board policy also ties this into our service planning as well as to our budgeting efforts. So there is a annual, oops, sorry about that. There is we have a 2-year budget cycle. Every 2 years, our board of directors adopts the budget. And the service equity strategy is tied to that so that we can identify needed improvements and make sure they're actually funded so that they can be implemented. So it's not just a policy document that sits on the shelf, but it's actually a living document that is used to modify our service. We've had 2 of these strategies that have been completed, and there is now a 3rd strategy underway this year as we speak. These are actually a couple of slides that were presented from the strategy. So we're in fiscal year 21-22, and what is happening now is that there are, as part of the work to develop the equity strategy, there's demographic data that's reviewed to identify low-income populations of color. As you can see on this map, across San Francisco, we have identified 9 neighborhoods in the city that would benefit from an equity approach for transit service. This also falls under the Federal Civil Rights Act Title VI requirements for transit agencies to ensure that they're providing service to all populations equitably. And this is really it's a collaborative approach that, while it does have a lot of quantitative work done, there's also a qualitative element which I will get into as well. So in terms of the quantitative work, we have a robust set of data that is used to track our service performance, everything from tracking our buses using GPS to onboard passenger counters, both surveyors and actual digital counters. And so that data is utilized to provide a robust quantitative analysis for each neighborhood. And you can see here on the metrics here on the left that we utilize. So not just vehicle, but conditions, but also how the vehicles are operating within the city. San Francisco is a very dense city. It's a very congested city. So we also want to make sure that our transit service is competitive. Many times individuals who are working may not be working 9-to-5 jobs. They might be working shift jobs. And so, the transit auto time ratio that's listed is really important because you want to make sure that it's actually competitive, that you can get to your workplace without having to need to drive because the time is just too intense to, if you have to actually take multiple buses or train modes. You can see on this chart here, and we can see my cursor, but we're identifying areas where there are performance issues. That's the real-time data that we have can capture that, those boxes in red. And so that identifies areas where there might be improvements. Maybe there's a need for signal improvements, or potentially adding a transit-only lane, or perhaps it's doing something more micro, like enforcing double parking so that buses aren't delayed. And we're also looking at, is the service that we are funding getting out on the street? And so there's this metric we've added on scheduled service hours delivered, because there are challenges where one of the issues we've had in the San Francisco Bay Area is that because of the high cost of living here, it's been hard to retain transit operators. People are moving, will be leaving the area or leaving our agency for other agencies outside the area. So we want to make sure, and that means that there's sometimes challenges around missed runs or basically service that we schedule, but we don't necessarily have operators available. So we want to make sure we aren't disenfranchising our lower income communities because people are waiting for a bus that should be there and isn't showing up. And just as Fred was mentioning, we do have to go out and talk to the people. And so there's this chart that just illustrates some of the feedback that we do. And so it's actually going out and reaching people where they're at. Like you said, talking to community members and operators, and we definitely are doing that. We're doing visits, to schools. They're work going directly to community organizations. Of course, there's online feedback, but one interesting change we made in the last update that we're going to continue this time is actually have a focus group with our operators. Many of our transit operators, are San Francisco natives, and even though some of them, or actually a lot of them, fortunately aren't able to afford to live in the city, they still have their ties and roots to family who are in the city, and often bring up service challenges that we might not be aware of just from looking at the quantitative data or our sort of lived experience, working as professional planners. So having that kind of really thoughtful and intentional outreach is really, really key. I know right now there's work to look at developing some, doing remote meetings so that we can, even this time of the pandemic, still get that kind of community feedback that you would normally get from like doing going to like a farmer's market or a church to like get feedback. All these things are happening virtually now, so we're having to retool our outreach efforts. But that is work that is happening currently. And so based on the feedback we received from customers, both from focus groups, we also track customer complaints that come in. We look at how we can, again, identify what lines are being most impacted. Again, as I mentioned, operator shortage is something that we're looking at addressing. We're also doing that by hiring, but also where we can allocate service to ensure that if there are ones that are missed, that they're not being missed in our most needed areas. And then there's ongoing work with other community organizations. And so like not just city organizations, like San Francisco, we have a youth commission, so they're linked in, but also other civic organizations that represent communities that have large populations of low-income individuals. And so we are working with those, our city partners and community-based organizations to make sure that they're engaged in this process. So and again, we've had, two previous reports. We're working on a third report now. And I think the key difference this year is that we're also looking at focusing on ensuring the equity policy principles are not just impacting service, but other transit and other planning policies that are happening. We have in the strategy looked at, and we'll be looking at identifying new routes that might be potentially added if, of course, some of this was envisioned before the downturn, but the ideal, I think now might be to look at how we can, if we have to make service reallocations, how we can do so in a manner that has the least impact on low income and populations of color. So that's work that will be happening over the next year. And just actually wanted to go back there real quick to just point out, like having this kind of framework in place, already, and actually having had now 4 years of work, it really has created an equity lens. And one of the things that we've seen, like as we've had to change service and reduce service during the pandemic, since our shelter in place started in mid-March of this year, we really focused on keeping those core service lines that were identified in part by the equity strategy as it's not just our busiest lines, but also lines that serve communities that without transit service wouldn't have access to employment centers, to essential services like hospitals and grocery stores. So in addition to this internal community strategy, we also have that's focusing on transit service. We have engaged in sort of larger planning efforts. I just wanted to touch on those really briefly. There is an effort in the Bay Area called the Community-Based Transportation Plan. And these are funded by our regional agency, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. They're prepared by local agencies. City and counties, DOTs take a lead. But should emphasize they're usually done in partnership with community-based organizations. So it's partnered with nonprofits that are serving particularly communities that are low income, communities of color. Here in San Francisco, we completed 2. There was a Western Addition, which is a neighborhood just west of the Civic Center City Hall area. Historically Black neighborhood that, those of you who were planners have probably read about, because that was an area where a lot of redevelopment actually first occurred, and a lot of displacement and gentrification occurred in what was a historically Black area. And we most recently completed a community-based transportation plan in the Bayview, another historically African-American area that actually is now historically Black, has a large, actually the plurality residents are now Asian American. There's also a lot growing Latino population there. And so we are looking at service challenges. It's also like in the southeast part of the city and sort of one of the geographically more isolated areas, even though it's, because there's very few direct transit connections to our downtown employment core. So that plan looked at transit options as well as other like livability options within the community to improve access both to local services as well as to downtown and regional connections. Two other efforts that are happening in the Bay Area also include a low-income means-based transit pass program. Muni actually started, again, in part, I think, because of the advocacy of community groups. We have had our own Muni low-income transit pass, so you pay a reduced rate for a monthly pass if you are on certain government social benefit programs. And our regional agency has actually launched this year a pilot to expand that concept of they're calling Clipper Start to 5 transit operators. So not just Muni, but also BART, Golden Gate Transit, some of the other regional transit operators, so that an individual won't just have a low-income pass for San Francisco, but could also use that to connect to jobs and employment and educational destinations across the Bay Area. Finally, we've set up a bike share for all program. This was actually done at the regional level, actually in Oakland, but it's also expanded to San Francisco. And this is part of the effort to make micromobility more accessible, and that it's in partnership with Lyft, who's the regional bike share operator. There's a $5 annual pass if you qualify as a low-income individual. And then the second year, it's a $5 a month pass, and that allows you, free usage of bike share vehicles once you qualify for that. And there's been a lot of innovations around ensuring that individuals can pay by cash. If you don't have a credit card, there's been work to establish a way that you could still access bike share. So that's been another success. I think one challenge has been how might that expand to other communities. And then just want to quickly just touch on, we are in this time of a pandemic, and and also now, it's time of social, unrest after the tragedy of George Floyd's murder, and I think there's some questions that we as planners should be looking at as we're putting on an equity lens for the work that we're going to be doing. A lot of us are going to be facing having to look at how service might be changed or cut to deal with shrinking budgets. And so I would say, if your agency, hasn't done an equity strategy, look at how you could do that. I mean, the demographic data is a good first step, the quantitative data, but definitely looking at qualitative data and going out and actually talking to community groups, how they are using service, how they would like to use service. I mean, if you're re-envisioning, you might not have funding for a comprehensive service analysis like Fred mentioned, but maybe there are things you can do in-house to really look at how it can be tailored service to meet community needs. Just also want to point out, cashless options. I know there's a lot of concern about taking cash. I think one thing to consider about is how can we safely, if you're not able to do free service, or even as we roll back and start charging for service, how can we make paying for transit and transportation services safer without using cash, but also provide options for individuals who aren't banked? Because there's usually, in our data, we've seen about 14% of individuals don't have bank accounts. This really hits hard on communities of color, and so think about how you could maybe provide free, access to free smart cards so that people can still use service without being having to handle cash. So that's my presentation on kind of sort of what we are seeing here in California in terms of directly addressing social equity in transit. And my contact information is here. And also Sandra Badia, I want to thank her. She's the project manager for the Muni Service Equity Strategy, has been working on this effort for a number of years and helped me with this. And definitely we're both available for any questions that you might have. Okay, so I'm going to now turn this over to Fleming, and he will continue and give us a sort of national perspective here.
Great, thank you, Kenya. Really appreciate it. Actually, Carlton, Fred, and Kenya, you gave some very insightful presentations, and I've learned a lot. So I want to thank you for that. I am going to actually wrap up by just sharing some national resources on how to incorporate equity in transportation decision making. But first, let me get my presentation going here. Okay. Okay. So for those, I just wanted to do a brief introduction. My name is, again, is Brenell Justice. I work as a community planner with the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Human Environment. And some of my program areas include environmental justice, equity analysis, context-sensitive design solutions, community impact assessment process, and public involvement. And I'll go through, I'm going to be talking about quite a few resources. I won't be able to go into detail on most of them, but I have provided the website or web links so you can go back and get additional information. First and foremost, just wanted to start off with our context of environmental justice at the Federal Highway Administration and also the US DOT guiding principles related to environmental justice. As you may know, the passage of Executive Order 12898 in 1994 required federal agencies to make achieving environmental justice a part of their mission. And at DOT, that means ensuring full and fair participation of all potentially affected communities in the transportation decision-making process, to avoid and minimize or mitigate disproportionately high and adverse effects on minority and or low-income populations. And finally, to prevent the denial of, reduction in, or significant delay in the receipt of benefits as relate to transportation programs and activities for minority and low-income populations. This is our environmental justice website. In addition to just environmental justice resources, it also includes Title VI, information on other non-discrimination statutes, and then also how they all tie together to achieve equity or equitable outcomes in transportation. Through the NEPA project development process, the planning, it also talks about or provides resources on how public involvement is applicable in every phase of transportation decision making, and collectively how that all influences equitable outcomes. So just real quickly, in terms of equity in transportation, so we're all on the same page of what it means. Equity seeks fairness and mobility and accessibility to meet the needs of all community members. Particular focus is given to the individuals in these population categories. I highlighted low income and minority as that's specific to environmental justice as it relates to the executive order I just spoke of. But all these population groups are generally traditionally underserved and or identified as communities of concern during the planning process. Just to reiterate the understanding or to try to advance the understanding between equity and equality. While equality is certainly applicable in certain instances, equal pay for equal work in circumstances, but in transportation, we're more focused on equitable outcomes. And so that means that we are working towards there being a level playing field. The image on the right was actually taken from my daughter's high school, and it states, fair isn't everyone getting the same thing, fair is everyone getting what they need in order to be successful. So that's in an educational context, but that is also applicable in transportation planning and project development. So just to highlight a few of the resources, this is one resource that was published last year out of our office on conducting environmental justice analysis during transportation planning and programming. It involves a scan of over 100 MPOs and all state DOTs in terms of their practices for conducting environmental justice analysis. And then from that scan and interviews we did with transportation practitioners, we came up with these 6 different kind of topic areas or focus areas that apply to environmental justice process for planning and programming projects. And these are detailed, and there's several examples in the publication, both at the state DOT level and various NPOs throughout the country of effective practices in each one of these categories. And then on best practices overall, we look at some of the categories or some of the decision-making tools, such as planning and environmental linkages, community impact assessment, and incorporating context-sensitive design solutions in the overall decision-making process. This is another resource that was published also last spring that's available on the website. I provided the link at the bottom of the slide. This one was more focused on looking at areas in the country that were experienced
This is Carlton Ely. Sorry to interrupt, but I currently don't hear you. I don't know if Christine has noticed that as well.
Yeah, we lost you, Fleming. I'm gonna try, let me try doing a little magic. Hold on, let me see if I can't get him back. Oh, it looks like he's offline. I think he might have lost internet for a moment. So how about this? While he tries to connect back, why don't we go into a couple questions while we're waiting for him to connect back?
Sure.
Let's see here. The first question that came through, and it looks like anyone can answer this one. Could you discuss what kind of transit service and policy strategies are helpful for elderly African Americans? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
I will say, so I think a lot of the same thoughts around equity and really planning and looking at your network apply. I do differentiate. There are, members of our community who need to take advantage of paratransit service. Like most, agencies, I think, are required to have paratransit service. We know it's a very specific type of service, and I'm not at all an expert on that, so I will say paratransit availability. But I'll say, I think it's duly on our transit agencies and on our cities to think about things like quality of sidewalks and curb cuts and shelters that are covered and protect from the elements. And stop spacing is important too, but I think the frequency of service, and then can someone who maybe is elderly walks a little bit slower, when they get to the stop, is there some shelter there? And then definitely for senior citizens, most agencies do have some type of fare subsidy, discounted fares, but I think those things all matter.
Anyone else have comments on that? Okay. Next question. This is a good one. How do we deal with low demand due to high unemployment, which is sort of the chicken and the egg problem? You can't take the new job because you can't get there. So how do we deal? How do you deal with that low demand right now?
I mean, I guess Kenya Carlton, that's a tough question. And I think it's, in part is where jobs are located. There's a mismatch in many communities between transit accessibility, where people live, especially people of color and low income communities and job clusters. I don't know if I have a great answer to that question. I think, agencies, and we've talked a lot about this, and I think even a conversation I had last week with our CEO, transit should really, I think we get too often the routes we think we need to serve and not necessarily looking at destinations where people live and where they need to go. I don't think transit's and it's never going to be able to service 100% of all locations, but I think we can try to really identify the places people are and they need to go, and how can we move people to those locations. There are trade-offs, right? You can have a large coverage network that has a lot of routes that go a lot of different places, but it's going to be slower, longer headways. And, I think that there's a lot of trade-offs, and those are the tough questions that we can't avoid, but I don't think there's an easy answer to.
Yeah. And I didn't respond or jump in immediately because I guess I was thrown off by the framing of low demand. And I was trying to wrap my head around what that actually meant. Because from my point of view or perspective, although someone may be unemployed, it doesn't mean they won't have a need to use public transportation, because obviously persons normally have a need for such services just to take care of daily needs, like going to the grocery store, going to the doctor, just simply going to visit friends, etc. So the employment issue is an important issue. I think the demand, if you don't have a personal vehicle, is always going to be there. But speaking towards the issue of transportation or transit decisions being driven by employment needs, some case examples that we often look to include like the work in West Garfield, Chicago, with the Bethel transit-oriented development stop that was put there. The lesson learned from that particular experience was when Chicago was at a point where it was actually considering to defund one of its transit stops, the residents in that immediate community had to speak up and to stress that they needed actually transit so that they could, one, get to work, and so that two, they could take care of their daily needs. And so I offer that just simply to amplify the fact that residents who may be unemployed understand the importance of transit. They understand the necessity of it in order to get to jobs. The demand is there. But I want to make sure that we understand that the demand for transit is driven by a number of different factors, not just unemployment. Kenya, you may be muted. Kenya, I think you're muted.
Yeah, okay, now I'm muted. And I would just add, in addition to the points that Carlton and Fred made, that I think it also, as we're looking at this, times of high unemployment, goes back to the what we've seen here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where one of the barriers we found to using transit, especially our regional operators, is the high cost of fares. We have, like, our rail operators have a distance-based fare structure where if you're trying to get to employment or to like a social service that's farther from your city, you're going to be paying $7, $8 one way. And so that's where, like, the means-based fare program I talked about, the Clipper Start, is really important. So I think also looking at your fare structure and seeing, are there ways we can provide some kind of discount or accommodation to address individuals who are having financial challenges due to the recession.
Next question, Kenya. Does the means-based transit passes exclude those who normally would get senior reduced rate pass if they're working, or are they included in that?
That's a good question.
I guess what is included?
I don't have the full details on that. I mean, it's just was launched in February and it's still in the rollout process. So I'd be happy to share a link for that information. But just kind of pulling up what where the proposal, it depending on the operator, it's a 20 to 50% fare discount, and it is targeted towards adults. There's a separate initiative that's happening to address youth fares for the 18 and under population, where some services have been providing actually free passes for like high school students and K through 12 students. but I know here in the Bay Area, we have, like Fred mentioned, a subsidy program for individuals who are seniors, where they pay, usually it's a 50 to 60%, 65% discount off of the base adult fare. So this is actually separate from that. So this would apply to adults who don't qualify for a senior or a disabled person discount. So yeah. So hopefully that answers the question.
We're going to stick with you for a second here. Can you discuss how the agency considered adopting the equity policy? Some organizations are hesitant to want to look into formal policies surrounding it, and the person asking the question just wants to know what strategies he can use to get the issue properly discussed.
Yeah, I think here in the Bay Area, there's just there's a real strong political consciousness around equity issues, just on a broader sense. So we had advocacy groups, groups like public advocates. We also our agency is managed by a separate board than our elected board of supervisors for the city, and so the city's board of supervisors were also pushing. They had proposed that's what the charter amendment I mentioned. They had proposed let's try and create a new law mandating an equity strategy. I think one of the things you could do as a practitioner, though, is to we talk about the federal requirements that we have to look at populations, that are low income, that are populations of color. I mean, what we were just going into with the federal executive order, those are mandates that the Federal Transit Administration, every transit operator has to follow. And of course, there's also the Title VI audit process that FDA requires that you can annual audits. And so I think between Title VI and the executive order on EJ, those are kind of two legal levers that I think management should be cognizant of, because if you're not mandating those, it's likely you're going to have advocates push back. And I mean, an example here in the Bay Area that we have, subway operator actually lost $100 million because when they were building the Oakland Airport connector, they didn't do a Title VI analysis, and even though the airport is adjacent to East Oakland, which has a super majority of Black and brown folks, and so the advocates took a complaint to FTA, and FTA actually ruled against MTC and the BART and said that didn't do a Title VI analysis, and they pulled out I think $7 million from the capital project. So the airport, the city, the agency had to get a loan to for that. So there could be a real financial penalty assessed if your agency doesn't do the right thing and you look at a social equity strategy.
And if I can jump in, the question was about how do you jumpstart a conversation? I guess when you're working inside of an agency where there's a little bit of inertia, and I know from that experience, I know what it's like. And so for me, in terms of strategies that are appropriate, sometimes it's just the small things that really matter. If you work inside of an agency that may not have the political will, one of the things that's going to be important is trying to identify ways to have a conversation like this, whether it be a webinar or whether it be hosting a lunch and learn conversation. Those type of small things are important, not just because they facilitate ways to educate your agency or educate your immediate peers, but also they serve as a way to educate you as an advocate, because of the fact that you have to do your own homework in order to be effective in discussing these issues in a rather cogent way. And so whether it's doing a lunch and learn, whether it's setting up a webinar, taking the time to have conversations with allies and trying to identify who those persons may be within your agency who have a greater sense of appreciation for these type of issues. And sometimes they're not going to be within your immediate office, they're going to be in other parts of the agency. So I would recommend all those strategies.
Okay. It looks like Fleming has rejoined us. His sound was a little funky for a second. I'm going to try unmuting him again. So I'm sorry if there's all kinds of feedback. I just want to test and see where he's at with his sound. Hey, Fleming, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, my apologies. I was going through my slides. I got disconnected halfway through and had no idea that I was disconnected.
We're glad to have you back.
Thank you.
We just, when we saw that you disappeared, we just went ahead and jumped into the Q&A. So now we can pause Q&A for a moment, and Fleming, you can pick up where you left off.
Okay. All right. Do I have control? Let's see. Not sure. Let me see if I can. Do you want to move the slides? I don't think I have control of the slides at this point. Can you hear me?
We can hear you,
Yep.
Fleming. I can't
Sorry,
hear
I was on, it was me on mute this time.
Okay.
Boy, we're a lot today, aren't we? Okay, Fleming,
Right.
I just given you controls back. So now you can pull up your presentation again, and we can continue where we left off.
All right. Let me try to do this. I'll go through this very quickly. So I just want to make sure, is this the slide that showing when we left off?
I think it was. Yes, it was.
It was.
Can you go up and hit display settings and just swap your screens for me? And then we'll be all set. Thank you.
All right. Okay, still connected?
You are good to go.
Okay. I am so sorry, goodness gracious. I will go through this very quickly. As we were leaving off, I was just going through some resources that we have at FHWA, and this is one on addressing changing demographics and EJ analysis. This particular one, we took a look at how communities are considering changing demographics in their long-range transportation planning processes. And we had some case studies, but essentially we're going through and finding out how communities are incorporating considerations of their investments as it relates to changing demographics in low-income and minority communities. Okay. This one is a community impact assessment guidebook. This one is a resource that was published a couple years ago and just goes into a little details about how to take stock of all the resources, whether it be cultural, social, or otherwise, incorporate that into the transportation activity, whether it be planning or project development. This resource was initially published in 1996, but updated in 2018. And also the website is provided here for more details. I did go into a little information on our active transportation, or how to incorporate more equity considerations in active transportation plans and programs. This particular resource was developed about 4 years ago, but it talks about all the equitable considerations for low income, minority, and other underserved populations as it relates to improving access to jobs and other essential services, with a specific lens on active transportation connections and connectivity. This is one I had talked through on our tolling and road pricing. Obviously, there's considerations, or should be considerations, for low-income populations when there is tolling as part of a transportation project. And so we have collected best practices case studies for state DOTs and tolling authorities, and how they've integrated equity considerations when there's tolling or road pricing considered for a project or retrofit. This is a program that is actively going on now. It is our Complete Trips ITS for Us deployment program. It is focused on helping all users of the transportation system to reach their destination without gaps in the travel chain. I did want to mention that there is $40 million available to communities to showcase their innovative business partnerships, technologies, and other practices to expand access to transportation for people with disabilities, older adults, individuals with low income, and other underserved populations. And more information is provided through the link on the slide. During Fred mentioned improving access to opportunity during his presentation. I did want to mention that we have a number of resources at FHWA on that same accord. All of these resources discuss how to improve connectivity and ease of travel to jobs and essential services and improve connectivity. Also, there's information on actually how to measure your connectivity and access to jobs and other opportunities. So I would, don't have time to go into a lot of details on each and every one of these, but suffice to say, we've been on that accord and have quite a few resources to help improve access to opportunity. Related to mobility innovation, we have a number of resources in terms of how to consider equity as it relates to shared mobility, whether it be a bike share program, e-scooters, electric scooter program, or other emerging technologies. That also relates to considerations for how deployment of automated and connected vehicles will impact underserved communities, as well as we look at demands on our curb space, equitable distribution of space for the various uses that are needed now and in the future. So there's quite a few resources there. We have a public involvement website, which also provides a host of resources. And currently, I did want to mention that we do have, through our Everyday Counts initiative, virtual public involvement that we're providing technical assistance on how to be inclusive as we move to more virtual formats for virtual town halls or just engaging the public in our decision-making process virtually. So we have webinars, the resources, and providing technical assistance to field offices, state DOTs, and MPOs on virtual public involvement, and more information is available through the website here. This is just a snapshot of a few of the resources that are available on that website, including virtual public involvement. I'll close with just a few training resources. We have our National Highway Institute provides a host of web-based and in-person courses. We have 2 web-based courses that are offered currently: Fundamentals of Environmental Justice and also the Basics of Public Involvement in Transportation Decision-Making. Those courses are available free of charge to anyone who is interested. You can just go to the link on the website provided on the slide. Our instructor-led courses are not being offered currently due to COVID-19, but those will get back online once we get to a place where we can provide trainings in person. A few other resources: our Resource Center, which is part of FHWA, provides targeted technical assistance. If you have a specific issue that you need assistance with relating to planning or project development, and also FTA through their National Transit Institute has a number of environmental justice courses and also considerations of equity in transit planning. And these are just a few other information I wanted to share. We have internal working groups on environmental justice within DOT-wide, within FHWA, and there's also a federal interagency working group on environmental justice. And I also wanted to mention one upcoming event. The AASHTO Center for Environmental Excellence has an environmental justice community of practice, and we have a virtual peer exchange on July 12th from 2 to 4 p.m. You can register for that event through this link provided on the website. As I mentioned, TRB is one of our stakeholder organizations, and we're helping to plan an equity conference that will be September of 2021. So more information to come on that, but that's all hands on deck as we plan for that event about 1.5 years. And that concludes my presentation. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties.
No worries. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And if you want to go ahead and just keep that last slide up for us, just so that folks can see everyone's contact info, that would be great. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so let me power up my questions here again. Okay, this question. We have had an issue with people experiencing homelessness consistently and consistently occupying bus shelters and seats on vehicles. how have any of your agencies balanced equity considerations of serving those experiencing homelessness and the need to provide clean and sanitized stops and vehicles for other users of the system during COVID-19?
Well, I know I can just speak here in San Francisco. That's been we have a tremendous homelessness challenge, which has just gotten worse during the pandemic. I think one of the things that I know has been happening are, at least at the end of the line, our operators, do clear the vehicles out. But we have been working and starting to deploy mobile cleaning crews. Buses will be, cleaned after a run, or at least in the middle of their service period. So, I mean, if you have the resources, that might be a way to at least provide some sanitizing, and as well as to, during this. But yeah, I think that's a challenge that every operator will, if they're not facing now, will be facing. But I don't know, Fred, if there's any novel treatments in New Orleans you're all are thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when we went to, like many agencies, a no-fare system during COVID to create a safer transit service environment for our operators and our riders, the amount of unhoused people riding did increase. And I think while it hasn't been a major issue, it is. I think this goes back to kind of how we provide a safe environment for our riders, and thinking again, some of the national conversations. We have had some, like, I know we partnered with the city and the Department of Health in providing transportation to housing for unhoused people during COVID. And I think actually it was a very good model set up, and there was a lot of cooperation involved. So I think using tools like that, but it has to be I do think it's a little bit unfair to put it all on the agency. The problem is a bigger problem nationally than just transit agencies. And like many things, I think sometimes we expect agencies to fix issues that they don't do. So it's something that we should address. And I think some agencies, I know LA Metro has done a lot of work around dealing with unhoused populations, and even hiring special, I think they hire essentially social workers or individuals with social worker type skills to work with those populations at stations and at shelters. So I think that's one option for larger agencies, but to think about how we can do it in a way that protects people's rights and also protects the safety of our operators and other transit riders.
Right. Yeah. Just actually on that note, I would add, our San Francisco being a city and county, and our transit agency is housed within that municipal construct. We have a Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and so we are actually also working with them to provide interventions. In our downtown core, we have a homeless, persons experiencing homelessness action team that she does go out and patrols. And so if they get a call from an operator or from a member of the public, they will intervene and see if they can find individuals a location to go to. We are currently, actually, the city is takes the funding from the state, and the federal government is actually now providing hotel rooms. And so if you're experiencing homelessness, you are eligible to get free housing during this period. And so that's another intervention that, thanks for reminding me about that, Fred, that we are doing in partnership with a city department. So at least for the larger municipalities, I'd say, if you reach out to your social service agencies, that definitely is a way. But we do want to make sure that we have a safe environment for our operators, for our passengers, and for all passengers, even those experiencing homelessness. I think that again is something we're going to just all be grappling with for some time now.
Fred and Kenya, I mean, if you can speak to it, obviously there's some problems that are so nuanced that they can only be resolved through collaboration or through partnerships. Based on your experience, are you aware that other cities have been basically trying to facilitate and create these special partnerships in order to address the issues that are pertaining specifically to this question? Or are there ways in which they share information with one another in order to perhaps identify what are going to be better practices in order to resolve some of the challenges between this nexus between homelessness and transportation facilities, and also trying to give people proper accommodations, just permanent accommodations?
Right. I mean, here in California, we're definitely seeing those kind of partnerships occur. Even before the pandemic, because of our really large population of unhoused individuals, we were finding that even if individuals were looking for a place to basically be during the day, they were transitioning from our muni system to BART, our regional railway, and riding that system throughout the region. And so I think BART reached out to the city, and like we were trying to figure out how they could develop a strategy, and they actually are kind of modeling San Francisco's approach and creating a social services team that will intervene. And so instead of having to call the police, which also kind of bringing back the challenges that we're seeing after what's happened with George Floyd, and I think there's now like a consciousness about how we intervene. And traditionally it was like you call 911, which of course dispatches an officer who's not a social worker, someone who's not really professionally trained to intervene in a situation around someone who is experiencing homelessness or unhoused. Now we're looking at how we can actually get, so even those conversations about how you can actually get professionals that are trained and can provide services were happening before. And I think that is hopefully an approach that other jurisdictions would take. I mean, it'd be great to see like some guidance from even like FTA or APTA about that, because I think that would be really useful to set a baseline for the conversation of how that can happen nationally.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I know that it is. I think there's also some thought about land use, public spaces, and design in this. Probably the most, in industry, have an equitable network that we're working on. We also have a horrible existing condition for our downtown transit hub, which exists kind of as a compilation of different stops. Compounding that, we had a building fall down, a hotel infrastructure fall down, essentially on the nexus of two of our streetcar lines and at our bus hub in October, which meant we had to move a lot of our downtown transfer points to another location. And I think one of the things we've seen is there's some urban design and kind of integration of stops and spacing the street that can make a huge difference as far as providing spaces for riders to feel safer. And additionally, I'm interested if anyone out there has suggestions, please pass them on. We are in the process of applying for funding grants to actually build a physical downtown transfer location. And I think one of the things that has to be addressed with that, if we build a physical facility, how do we create it and design it in a way that makes it safe and accessible for our riders? And also maybe are there supportive services, maybe working with business improvement districts downtown? I know we have the downtown development district that's been a much more engaged partner on transit conversations that, and you're right, Carlton, I think it is all hands on board kind of strategy of not just relying on punitive enforcement, but thinking about how we can use all the tools at our disposal in planning processes and implementation at agency level to try to address the issue. And you're right, I think y'all make a great point. It's not just one solution, but I think there's a number of things we need to make sure we look forward to try to identify and put in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up here. Just as a reminder, we are recording this webcast and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube, will pop up, and we will have a PDF copy of most of our presentations available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and that link is also where you can go to register for all of our future webcasts. So thank you to the Planning the Black Community Division for hosting this really timely webcast for us, and to our speakers, Carlton and Fleming and Fred and Kenya, thank you for joining. This was sort of an all-star cast, so it was a great diverse group of perspectives here. So everyone have a great weekend, stay safe, and we will talk next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you all.